Alright, now that we've learned to move the camera with our view, let's learn a little bit more about the camera itself. Now I'm still using the table blend file, but you can work with any file you like. Let's select our camera and enter camera view, numpad 0. So far, we've been rendering in the camera's default settings. Let's look at what we can do with our camera beyond that. With our camera selected, let's select the Render Context button in our Properties editor. Right below Render, we can see our Dimensions panel. Now by default, we're rendering at 1080p. We can choose any number of screen settings from the presets. We can also create our own by checking the plus sign next to the presets and naming a custom one. But we won't worry about that right now. Now, we can manipulate the camera the same way we would any other object. Let's go to a quad view. Control-Alt-Q. If I choose to hit G and move my camera in the top view, you can see the changes update in the perspective view. And as we learned during the creation of our table scene, we can make any number of changes to our view, and then align our camera to the view using Control-Alt-0. Without locking our camera to view, we can get a more detailed position by using the next method. If we've gotten close to the view we want, and pulled our camera to our view, we can fine-tune the render area in our Active Data Context button. Since we're close to where we want to be, rather than try and move the camera, let's make sure it's selected in our outliner. When we do, we can see that the Active Data Context button has changed to a camera. Let's select that. If you choose something else in the scene, perhaps the light or part of the table, you will see it change again. But for now, let's get back to our camera. In our lens settings, we have several options for manipulating our camera, and therefore our render. First, our camera is in perspective by default. That's fine. We're not going to mess with any of the other settings right now. Second, we can see we have a default lens of 35 millimeters. We can change that up or down, basically zooming in and out like using a different lens. However, for fine-tuning, we also have the ability to shift our render area up and down, or left or right, by using the shift controls at the bottom of our lens section. Using either Y or X, you can see how we can move that to get a finely tuned render. Now, that gives us a number of ways to get the camera angle and setting we want. Let's cover one more thing that often becomes relevant in very large scenes, and that's clipping. To demonstrate, let's go down a little farther under Display and check the Limits button. In our orthographic view, we'll see clipping lines appear from our camera. These tell us how close and how far our camera can render our scene. By default, our near plane is 0.1, or right in front of the lens. Our far plane is defaulted to 100. In the case of our little table scene, that's much farther than we need. But in a very large scene, that might need to be increased dramatically. Let's look at the near plane clipping and push that number out a bit. If we push far enough, we can see our perspective view starting to cut off in the front. Let's pull that back in and try our far plane. If we dial that back, we can see our scene begin to cut off from the back. Now, for many renders, the defaults will do just fine. But it's important to know that clipping is there if you need to make adjustments for the type of scene you're using, or as some kind of visual effect. For reference in future work, you should note that clipping, like most things in Blender, is an animatable property. This can be very useful in things like motion graphics. Alright, we've covered a lot of ground with cameras, but there's not going to be a quiz for this video. We'll touch on cameras many more times as we go. However, if you're not comfortable with what you've learned today, just be sure to rewatch the video. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.